Awesome. So I want to be mindful of your time, so we'll go ahead and get started. For those of you who are watching or will be watching, my name is Christopher Clark, and I am your outreach librarian. So welcome to another in a series of videos we are doing where we are interviewing cool people who do cool things. And today's cool person is Ed Finn. And he is the founding director of the Center for Science and the Imagination at Arizona State University, where he is an associate professor in the School for the Future of Innovation in Society and the School of Arts, Media, and Engineering. He also serves as the academic director of Future Tense, a partnership between ASU, New America, and Slate Magazine, and co-director of Emerge, an annual festival of art, ideas, and the future. Ed's research and teaching explore the workings of imagination, digital culture, creative collaboration, and the intersection of the humanities, arts, and sciences. Welcome, Ed. And to start things off, I just wanted to ask for those who may not know about it, what is the Center for Science and the Imagination?
Sure, thanks, and thank you for having me. The Center for Science and the Imagination is this wild, crazy idea that I got to bring to life almost 9 years ago now, and it's been this tremendous ride ever since. And maybe the best way to tell you about it is to tell a little origin story for it. So in 2011, the science fiction writer, well-known novelist Neal Stephenson, had written this essay called Innovation Starvation about how we seem to have lost our ambition to do big stuff and think big and have optimistic visions of the future that inspire people to take on major challenges and problems. And that instead we've defaulted back to this more incremental notion of progress, and we're not taking care of even the big things that we built. You know, our infrastructure is failing. And at this point in 2011, the shuttle program had ended. So the United States wasn't even sending our own people into space anymore. We were paying other people to carry our astronauts into space. And so it was sort of a polemic, you know, about how our relationship with the future seemed to have become more dystopian and apathetic. And Stevenson was at an event in Washington, D.C. for one of the very first Future Tense events, which you mentioned briefly in your introduction. And the ASU's president, Michael Crow, was there too. And being the kind of guy he is, Michael Crow said, well, you know, Neal, maybe this is actually your fault. Instead of blaming the scientists, the engineers for not thinking big anymore, maybe what we need are to come up with these optimistic stories about the future that are going to inspire people to go out and make those things real. And so that conversation sort of struck a spark, and it led to a couple of things. So Neal Stephenson went off and he started thinking about that, and he started talking with writers and technologists and other people that he knew about what it would mean to come up with these technically grounded, optimistic stories about the near future. So not something 500 years away where you can really imagine almost anything you want, and it's a little too distant to really motivate change today, but the near future. And at ASU, we started having conversations about what it might mean to actually take this challenge on from a university perspective. So I had a very fun afternoon, not realizing in any way that this was like going to be taken seriously. I just made up the idea for the Center for Science and the Imagination. And I found this quote from Albert Einstein: imagination is more important than knowledge. And I just started thinking, well, what would happen if you brought these different communities together, the science fiction writers and the storytellers and the artists with the scientists and engineers, and tried to take on this broader challenge of changing our relationship with the future. And from that seed and that initial set of conditions, the center has really blossomed, and it turned out that this was a thing that people were interested in, and that there was something there to do. And our mission is to inspire collective imagination for better futures. So it's been really, really awesome to get to work on this intersection of the problems that we have today and the people who are currently excluded from conversations about the future, and also to connect in the amazing things that are happening in terms of technological research and science and engineering. And to do that from, my background is in the humanities, to do that from a humanities grounding and explore what it means to use storytelling as the primary lens that we're going to tackle these problems with, because you can't imagine a better future, you can't build a better future unless you can tell a story about that future. And science fiction is really helpful as a toolkit in that regard, because it gives us vocabulary, it gives us different sort of tropes and ideas that we can use to then debate, well, is this the future that we want? We can have a story about robots, and as Neil Stephenson likes to say, a good science fiction story can save you thousands of hours of meetings and PowerPoints, because everybody can get on the same page with a big idea. And once you write the story about the robots, you have to have humans in your story, you have to have characters, you have to have people that you care about. And then you can have a real debate, and the engineers and the policymakers and everybody else can all have the same conversation through the story in a way that would be much more difficult if we were just talking about white papers or referee journal articles. So that was a very long answer to your question, what is the Center for Science of the Imagination? But that's the sort of starting place for who we are, and happy to tell you more about things that we're up to too. But that I think it's helpful to get that story to explain, because it's a pretty unusual and interdisciplinary thing, and it didn't really start out as a project of an academic discipline or anything like that. And we don't think of ourselves that way, and we really think of our remit as trying to reach many, many different parts of our own university and other universities, and then lots of other audiences beyond that.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And one of the things that really fascinates me about this CSI is, so because I also kind of started out with a humanities background, and I remember like reading about like the two cultures, got like the humanities and science, and that they don't really meet in the middle, right? Or at least that's the myth. And so I was really interested, because as somebody who came from the humanities, who is really interested in science and what's and what's going on with like technological innovation and all of this, how do you see those disciplines? Like, do you feel like that separation is kind of a myth, or is like, where do you see the overlaps, I guess?
That's a great question. And I think that in some ways the unsatisfying answer is all of it is true. So there are a lot of people who are really breaking down that barrier and doing amazing things that are at the intersection of art and science. I'm on the publication committee for Leonardo, which is this international art science organization. And there are a lot of scientists and researchers who have begun increasingly to recognize the importance of communicating with broader publics and taking on that role of writing for popular audiences and speaking for popular audiences, and modeling how science is not just important, but also really fun and inspiring. And so, I think that's important work. And you see more and more, I think, through the emergence of fields like maybe medical humanities, that the two cultures are realizing that they have a lot to talk about and a lot to share. And on the engineering side, I think there's a growing recognition that we need the critical foundations and the reflection that humanities and liberal arts type of educations typically offer. And we desperately need those right now in this world where we've been building an internet and social media and all of these online tools, and thinking of them really just as technical solutions to technical problems. But it turns out that these are cultural and social tools as well, and they're having huge impacts, sometimes very negative impacts. And the people who build these tools have suddenly realized that they have all these responsibilities that they, for one reason or another, did not see that they had before. So, and hopefully, I'm optimistic that we're going to keep moving in the direction of bringing more dialogue between the two cultures, as it were, in that space too. On the other hand, there's still plenty of division, and there are lots of people who say, well, that's not my area. That's not something I can talk about. That's not something I can do. And I think both in the sort of STEM camp and in the humanities and the arts, there are a lot of people who still have a kind of ideological rejection of these other methods. Say like, well, this is it's just they're just doing it wrong, right? Which is a very kind of stereotypical academic. When we're making fun of ourselves and our colleagues, these are the things we make fun of, right? That people just want to stay in their lane, and they want to they spent X number of years specializing in this one tiny track of inquiry, and anything outside of that track is either uninteresting or just wrong, right? And you see that attitude played out in lots of different ways. And frankly, it's still reinforced in many ways by the way that we've structured the politics and the infrastructure of higher education and the university system, the way that we do research. So much of it still is organized around these tracks and deep specialization that really thwarts people who are trying to learn across different fields. But history has shown us time and again that people who are able to get out of their individual track and start to see problems from multiple angles and to be open to learning from many different perspectives and modes of inquiry are the people who tend to make the breakthroughs and come up with really exciting new ideas and ask really exciting new questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I want to ask you in a minute about some of the projects that have kind of emerged from CSI, but before that, I'm kind of curious because as you were talking, you mentioned it started in, was it 2011? You said.
Right, that was when the initial conversation started happening, and then the center launched in 2012.
Okay, so what I'm kind of curious about is just like looking back at 2020, especially like starting in the place where you were, and you mentioned this kind of being an opportunity to help imagine better futures and things. How has 2020 I guess because I know it became a year for everyone where we really relied on science in a whole new and very impactful way. Has that kind of changed, or I guess your approach to the CSI, or how you engage with it, or has it just made it feel all the more prescient? Or I'm just kind of curious your thoughts on that.
So I think of 2020 in a lot of ways as a year of imagination, because it really forced us, it broke us. Speaking, we all like to get into our grooves and stay in our grooves. And 2020 was this year of huge disruption. It pushed all of us to do things that everybody said were impossible before, and to try radical new things. And when I think about imagination, I think what I mean by that is this fundamental capacity that we all have to imagine not just the future, but also to imagine the lives of other people, to imagine things that might happen. And that imagination is a central part of how we assemble the story of ourselves and what's happening around us. That we sample little bits of data from our sensory input, and we stitch that together into a story about what's happening, where we've been, where we're going. And so imagination is the ignition system for all this other stuff that we really care about, like empathy and foresight and resilience. And 2020 was a year that tested all of that in really severe ways, but also opened all of these new doors. And I think it was really hard to imagine a year ago that in the United States, so many people would be actively making choices and imagining and caring about strangers. This tends to be a very individualistic society. We're not used to that kind of, communitarian action. There's been for years a lot of reflection on how much more community oriented and sort of broadly oriented towards broad social cohesion, say East Asian societies are, and you could see people in countries like China or Japan much more willing to wear masks, right? And there's all this debate like, well, people are never going to do it here. Well, guess what? 2020 was the year that showed us that, you know, we're going to do it here too. And that's not just about, you know, rules or mandates. It's also about care. And, you know, whatever people think about COVID-19 and this pandemic, we've all had to find new ways to care about one another. And I think that's an imaginative act. It's really important. And, you know, the many different crises, the layers of crisis that all became more acute and were laid out in 2020 are also these spaces of opportunity and force us to imagine different futures. And I think that we all recognize at this point that there's no, you know, going back. We're not going to go back to the world as it was before this pandemic. Some things are going to change forever, including maybe that this virus is going to be around forever, right? It's just going to be part of our family of human viruses. So we're going to have to continue to adapt, and we need to imagine what we want to work towards, right? So I think that in some ways, the pandemic in 2020 overall was a surprise in its particulars, but I think it was not that surprising in general. You know, we already knew that this century was going to be one that's full of crises. You know, we had been thinking at CSI about things like climate and that's all still there, right? All of those other problems are they've just been pushed out of the headlines, but they're still around. And I think that 2020 showed us we're going to need to find new ways to work together. We need to work on this, not just individual imagination, but collective imagination. How do we start to tackle some of these big problems together? And the first step is making that imagination process more visible and figuring out how we think about these challenges in new and different ways.
Awesome, thank you so much. So you've kind of talked a little bit about what the CSI is and what the kind of the goals for it are. I'm also, so I guess maybe if you just wanted to talk a little bit about some of the projects that have come out of it, because from what I've seen, it looks like it covers all kinds of media. I've seen like anthologies, and I think there were some browser-based games and art projects, all sorts of cool stuff. So maybe if you just wanted to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I will. And one thing that we've tried to do is to keep learning and adapting and growing as an organization. And this started out as really just an idea, a notion, and now there are, I think, 6 full-time people working at the center, and all of those folks are really just the hubs for all these other wheels that are, you know, out there in the world spinning and making things happen. So we have a whole range of different projects, and we also believe very strongly in collaboration and trying to avoid reinventing the wheel and working with other groups and people who are doing amazing things rather than trying to duplicate something if somebody else is already out there doing it and doing it well. So we've explored a whole range of different things. We're just wrapping up now a multi-year project around the bicentennial of Mary Shelley's novel Frankenstein, and thinking about not just the past 200 years, but also the next 200 years, what Frankenstein can tell us about science and engineering and science and society now. The Mary Shelley story is not really science fiction anymore. It's very of the moment. People are creating these genetically modified organisms and talking about things like gene drives and maybe even exterminating entire species. All of this would have fit right into that Gothic novel. So that project, we did a bunch of different stuff, but we had these animating questions at the heart of it all around what does it mean to be alive? What is life? What are our responsibilities as creators? You know, how do we connect? What do we think? What do we mean? And what do we think about scientific creativity and responsibility? And then what does it mean to be human? You know, what do we learn about ourselves when we talk about creating other species, talk about playing God, talk about changing ourselves in different ways. So that was an amazing project and a lot of fun. There's an online set of videos that we designed as an alternate reality game that you can play through that are really fun, informal STEM learning resources. A major part of this work was funded by the National Science Foundation as an informal STEM learning project. And we built these activity kits that went to science centers and museums. I co-edited a new edition of Mary Shelley's novel that's annotated for scientists, engineers, and creators of all kinds, which you can buy at fine bookstores everywhere, but you can also read for free online at frankenbook.org. So it's a really nice online interface, and people can annotate themselves and see hundreds of annotations by different experts, science fiction writers and philosophers and scientists and engineers. Really fun. Another big project we did a couple of years ago was around the near future of space exploration and what space exploration is going to be like as it transitions from government-led to commercial enterprise. And the big question there really becomes, why are we going to go? You know, it's no longer the technical, how do we do it? Because we've solved the technical problems. A lot of them we solved 60 years ago. And there's still technical challenges. You know, it's not easy, but we know how to do it. And so the question becomes, why are we going to go? Who's going to get to go? And how are we going to pay for it? And so that the collection that we created there, which was supported by NASA, explores space commercialization in the context of history, economics, and also different space sciences, natural sciences, planetary science. And so that's a really fun collection of fiction and nonfiction. That's also available as a free ebook on the CSI website. What we're working on right now, I'm really excited about is just what I was talking about before. What do we really mean by imagination? What does it mean to talk about, if this is an ability that we all have, how do you harness it? How do you empower people? I think maybe the biggest problem we face as a species right now is that too few of us are really empowered to imagine the future. And if we just entrust it to a few really rich white guys in Silicon Valley, or even just some scientists in a lab, that's not enough. We need more people, and we need more diverse voices in the conversations about what we're going to make and how we make it. And so that we have a grant from the Spencer Foundation to explore this idea of applied imagination. And we just this morning, actually, we did a first planning exercise with a group of people around the country who are going to go out and have other meetings and start to connect with different communities of practice and just different regions of the country to talk about what imagination means to them, how they use it, and what it means even to do imagination work together. So I'm really excited, and I see that as the next big multi-year project is thinking about imagination as a kind of field, not just a field of study, but a field of practice that we need to pay more attention to, we need to make more visible. What's funny about imagination is that we mostly just notice it when it goes missing. We talk about failures of imagination. A giant catastrophe happens and we say, oh, why didn't we, the pandemic happens. Like, nobody thought of this. We couldn't have planned for it. It's like, of course, everybody knew this was going to happen sooner or later. And there have been many movies and books and, narratives about what was going to happen when we had a big pandemic. So it's a failure of imagination. It's not that we didn't know, all the information was there, right? We just didn't put the jigsaw puzzle together. We didn't have the guts to take the steps, right, to make the plans that we probably should have made. So how do we get better at this whole imagination thing? How do we make it more visible, and how do we value it? As we celebrate it in little kids, and then we pound it out of everybody in formal education. We push them all into those grooves and boxes and say, you're going to do this and you're going to do this. And then when they're all grown-ups, we're like, well, what happened? Why aren't you more imaginative? Why are you just staying in your tiny box? Get out of your box. So this is a problem that we need to work on in terms of education, in terms of community engagement, civic engagement, in terms of our storytelling. And I think, more broadly in terms of our cultural values and how we talk about and model the things that are really important, what we care about.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. So I kind of building on that idea of imagination, because I know uh, I know a lot of the projects to one degree or another. There, I know there's a lot of collaboration with science fiction writers and artists and so on. And so I'm curious about uh, uh, either both your personal experience and your experience as the director of CSI. Like, how has science fiction kind of informed your idea of like imagination and maybe even your relationship to both that and then the sciences?
Science fiction is a really interesting genre because it's a product of a modern relationship that we have with science and technology. Mary Shelley's character, Victor Frankenstein, is a scientist, and he becomes the iconic mad scientist, the bad scientist, right? Who puts his own hubris and his own goals ahead of everybody else's, and he cuts himself off from society, and he goes too far, and he makes these mistakes, and then he doesn't take responsibility for his mistakes. And that story gets retold and retold, and it's become this modern myth. Even if you've never read Frankenstein, you know the Frankenstein story, right? You've seen it on a lunchbox, in a cereal box. You've seen it in a cartoon or a movie. So Victor Frankenstein predates the emergence of the word scientist by about 10 or 20 years. So before we even had the word for the profession of scientist or someone we would identify as a scientist, we had this character and this idea that we have this deeply troubled relationship with our own curiosity and with our growing technological powers and prowess. And science fiction, some people point to Frankenstein as the first science fiction novel. There's some debate about it, but it's certainly a major milestone in the emergence of this new genre that blends other kinds of genre fiction, but this relationship, this sort of reflection on the language of technological progress. And what's really interesting about science fiction is that there's this continuing feedback loop between it and real science. And there are lots of science fiction writers who are practicing scientists or read the cutting edge scientific news. And there are lots of scientists who read science fiction and were inspired by science fiction to go into their careers. So this feedback loop is really powerful, and they trade words, that some things that were emerged for like Jules Verne's submarines or Robert Heinlein's rocket ships or Isaac Asimov's robots. These are all, canonical examples of things that were started as science fiction ideas. And the science fiction version of the idea sort of lights the way or casts a shadow, depending on how you want to look at it, that really shapes the way that actual things have been invented. So there's something very powerful about that, the way that language is used in science fiction, and the emergence of new words and the juxtapositions of words can be very powerful in creating new ideas. And a lot of what we do, where language is the original technology that we have, and it's so deeply embedded in our cognition that you really can make things happen just by moving the words around. You can come up with new ideas. So science fiction is really useful in that way as a toolkit. And I think what was distinctive, and we see it, other people doing this too, but certainly when we started out, I think it was pretty unusual that we were using science fiction as a methodological tool. And so we weren't really working for the science fiction genre or the science fiction fan community, even though we love the science fiction fan community, we love the genre, and we interact with many constituents in that world all the time. But the project of our center is not a science fiction project. It's about this broader question of futures. And so when you start to think about, well, what does science fiction do, and how could we use it to motivate people to feel a sense of agency and responsibility towards the future, that's when things get really interesting, and you can start to see the conventions of the genre as a way to open doors. Because there are a lot of people who are never going to pick up your article on scientific ethics, right? But who are going to be very willing to read a cool science fiction story about a robot that runs amok, right? And that becomes an invitation to start to have these bigger conversations and get into sometimes really challenging and uncomfortable questions. And science fiction is also a powerful way to address difficult problems of the present, problems of hierarchy and injustice, of all kinds of different challenges and lapses in responsibility. But by projecting them into the future, into a fictional space, you can get even the people who are really implicated and caught up in those problems can talk about them at a remove, and they can talk about them in a way that feels more safe and open. They can have more honest conversations without it feeling like, oh, I'm sort of fighting for my stake, because it's not about this world right now, it's about this future world that's just made up. And so people can start to have more honest discussions and deliberation that way.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. I'm also kind of curious about something you mentioned earlier, because you mentioned the importance of it being kind of interdisciplinary and collaborative. And I'm interested in this idea of collaboration because I know, like especially in the arts, right? There's this idea of like the lone genius making, like a masterpiece in isolation, isolated in a garret somewhere. And even though I feel like there's a general understanding that science is a little more collaborative with a lab setting and stuff, I feel like the representation of science in movies and whatnot, it still feels very like individual focused, right? The one scientist saying, no, don't do this or whatever. So I'm kind of curious your thoughts on that. And like, do you see this as kind of a bridging point to just being more open in all of these fields, to being more collaborative and less focused on like the lone genius, I guess?
I think that it's always collaborative. And when you look at it, the lone genius is probably going to be the first person to tell you that they're not a lone genius and that they rely on all these other people and they are standing on the shoulders of giants, to quote Einstein again. I think it was Einstein who said that, right? And maybe it was someone else. But our practices of invention and imagination and creativity are always intersubjective. They always happen between people, and we think with other people. And that's what culture is. Culture is people thinking together, right? It's not just one person. And so I think that what's interesting to me is why the myth persists, why we're so attracted to the idea of the lone genius, because I think we like to put people on pedestals and we like to tell these fairy tale stories about Steve Jobs or, pick your famous creative person and say, oh, they were an iconoclast. They did everything their own way. They were, unique. And not to take anything away from any of these people, because they were amazing people. But part of what, an essential factor to success is being able to work with other people and telling a compelling story about what you're trying to do. History is written by the people who tell the best story. And even when you look at the history of ideas, the best idea doesn't win. It's the idea with the best story that wins, right? That's the thing that takes over. We had electric cars 100 years ago in this country. That's, electric cars were everywhere. They were the predominant form of motorized vehicle. And then, the internal combustion engine told a better story. And so we switched. So this kind of thing happens all the time. And I think that it's bringing this back to storytelling. I think that coming up with the right stories to tell is really important for collaboration, because you have to create a space for people to collaborate. And it has to be a space that is safe for failure, for experimentation, for feedback, for people to work together. And a tremendous amount of the work that we do at CSI is finding the right way to invite people to create those spaces to get them to step out of their regular modes and put down some of their armor and be a little vulnerable and take some risks, and work together. And that's really, really important. And I think different disciplines have varying degrees of reflexiveness about all of that and the processes and what it means, and different ways of providing feedback. And the scientific conference where the speaker gets interrupted 30 times in the middle of their 20-minute talk with really blunt questions, and the studio critique in the art school. These are both ways in which people can do really sort of intensive critique and give a lot of feedback, but they rely on sort of powerful structures that are often not explored. They're tacit structures that are just kind of accepted, and people don't talk about them that much, and maybe don't even think about them that much. So what we're doing is we're making up new structures where you can have the scientist and the artist, and we say, well, we're gonna have to talk about this because you've never done this before. Nobody's put this particular group of people together before. So we're gonna have to make a new structure, and we're gonna have to explicitly talk about what the ground rules are and how we're gonna make this fun. And once you do that, it can be really exciting and inspiring. One of the common reactions we get, like we go to freshman engineering classes at ASU every year, and we do science fiction prototyping. So these engineers will, it's part of a Grand Challenge Scholars Program. So they're gonna come up with a solution to one of the grand challenges that the species is facing. But they'll start with a science fiction story. And a lot of them will help them write a science fiction story to work through their idea. A lot of them will say, I didn't know I was allowed to do this. I didn't know that I, as an engineer, was allowed to do science fiction writing. And that's what we have to do, is give people permission.
Yeah, no, that's such a great point. And I love this idea of permission and just creating new structures. And that kind of like ties in with something that I've been really impressed with, like some of like the publications and whatnot that you mentioned that the CSI does, that this is open for anyone to read and to access. So it's not like closed down, like you have to be enrolled as an ASU student to get access to these books or whatever. How important is that component to you in terms of like opening it up and making it accessible?
It's very important. ASU define, we have a charter with a bunch of design principles, and one really important part of that is impact. And so for us, if we're saying we want to change our collective relationship with the future, well, that's great. We want to get the ASU students involved in that, but there are also a lot of other people who don't go to ASU, right? So we take that seriously, and it's very important for us to reach as many people as possible and be as impactful as possible. So just the number of people isn't always that important. If we make a 30-second TV commercial, that's not going to really achieve our goals. But we want to have a real impact on as many people as we can. And because we're a public university, and because the nature of the work we do, we try to make as much of our work as possible freely available and accessible, and actually get people to go and find it. So it's not enough to just put it on a website somewhere, but really let people know, and also design it so that it is as beautiful and exciting and accessible as possible, and as useful as possible. And so that is a big part of our mission. We don't always do that. Sometimes, for example, when Neil Stephenson had that idea of technically grounded, optimistic futures, and he was talking to various people, that turned into our first big flagship project, which is called Hieroglyph. And that was an anthology that we published with HarperCollins. So that was a commercial book project. And I think that was the right way to do that, because it established a brand and it had the backing of this major publisher, and more people read that than they would have if we had put it up for free on our website, right? So there are a lot of different ways to define that impact. For the most part, we try to do things for free. Or I was really happy with how we did our Frankenstein book with MIT Press. So they were very excited and gracious about putting the whole book for free online, even at the same time as they were selling print copies of that book. And I think that's a great open access model. I hope more people can pursue it. For us, ultimately, the question is, who are we trying to reach, and how are we going to be most effective in reaching them?
Yeah, no, I think those are some great points, and especially as a librarian, that definitely really speaks to me. So I wanted to just ask you what are your hopes for the CSI moving forward? I know you'd mentioned the project on imagination. So yeah, maybe just anything that your hope that you kind of have in terms of like looking ahead to the future, what you'd like to do with the program.
Well, there are a few things. I think I've already mentioned this idea of formalizing and making bigger this field of imagination, because there are a few fellow travelers that we have lots of fellow travelers, but there are a few other academic institutions that are somewhat similar and that we occasionally interact with, and we'd love to collaborate with them more, and also reach out to places that maybe don't know we exist, but we think are doing the same kind of thing. They might be using different words for it or have a different framing, but to start to get all of these different people together. And one of our aspirations from the beginning has been to be the hub of a network and to connect people together. And that has really proven true at this point. People come to us with ideas, and we have lots of different people we can connect them to. And we have this growing network of people who think about imagination and do it in various ways around the world. So we want to keep building on that. I think that's really important. I'm very invested in climate and how I think this is the year to really take on the challenges of climate change and how we imagine positive climate futures. One of the big problems we've had there is we don't have very good articulations of what we're working towards. We know all the things that we're against, right? All the things that are bad and we should stop doing. But it's harder to say, well, this is it. This is the vision for what we want to work towards. And this vision, if you want to get to this place, we're going to tell you about it in concrete, exciting detail. If you want to get to this place, here are the things we have to do, right? We don't have that kind of a narrative or that kind of roadmap yet. And we need to work towards that. And so I'm very excited to build on some of the climate futures work we've done before and do new exciting things. And I'm also really interested in this, I mentioned it before, idea of how we empower different communities or support different communities in imagining their own futures. I think that we've been pretty successful in creating this model where we curate some amazing people and we bring them together and we have them come up with stories and visions of the future. And we've always been very clear that these are invitations, right? It's not like we've looked at our crystal ball and here are the answers and now you can just sit back and eat some popcorn and enjoy this movie. But that these are just jumping off points for people. But I think the next step is to, instead of bringing people to us and curating, a group of all-stars, is to find the all-stars and the people out in their own communities and, meet people where they are instead of doing it on our own turf. And so I'm really excited. And I think that has a lot of overlap with questions of justice and equity. And that can be in the context of structural racism and the many challenges that we in the United States have had with different kinds of inequality, but also things like socioeconomic harm and poverty around the world, the growing attenuation between the very rich and the very poor, climate and its impacts on these questions of justice and equity and who is impacted by climate change. So in all of these ways, we want to do more of that work and also see other people take on that work too. We want to make our processes and our ideas and tools and our knowledge as available as possible, accessible as possible, and invite other people to build on them, make them better, reinvent them, and put them to use. I'm always really happy when I see people borrowing our ideas or adapting them in various ways, whether we're acknowledged or not, because I think that's a huge compliment when that happens. And I think we want to strive to do more of that and do things that are, move beyond books and publishing fiction, which we're going to keep doing and we love doing. It's great work, but also create other kinds of tools and motivators for people to get out there and do this stuff.
So thank you so much, Ed. By way of wrapping things up here, speaking of structures, I always want to be mindful of the kind of structure imposed by me asking you questions, and then maybe there are questions that I didn't ask about things that you wanted to talk about. So I thought we'd end by just giving you the opportunity of, if there was anything that we didn't have an opportunity to talk about in the last 45 minutes or so that that you'd really like to address or mention, or any of that.
Well, I've talked about a lot. I think the only thing I'll mention we didn't really talk much about is, I have this related interest in technology and culture, and how our relationship with computers is changing, and what that means for even really basic stuff like reading and writing, and how reading and writing have really been transformed by the digital revolution. I think that's an open area, but that's another space like climate where we really need better stories about what we're working towards, instead of just all the stories about what we don't want to happen. So we had a project called AI Policy Futures that was funded by the Hewlett Foundation and by Google, where we explored what science fiction has to say about AI and what the near future of AI might look like, and how we connect it to issues like justice and sort of caring and empathy, and sort of what science fiction and technology policy have to say to one another more explicitly. So that was a really cool project to work on. We published 6 original stories in Slate as part of Future Tense Fiction as part of that. And that Future Tense Fiction is a great series, an original new story and a nonfiction response essay each month. That builds on some work that I did in my book, What Algorithms Want. And this area is changing so quickly that the book felt out of date almost as soon as it came out in some ways. And I'm really interested in that. I want to get back into all these incredible things that are happening now, as I think the tide is turning and companies like Twitter and Facebook are realizing just how important their role is, and how pretending that it's not their responsibility is, to govern the spaces that they made, that's really just not going to fly anymore. So I'm really fascinated by this Supreme Court sort of thing that Facebook has created to decide on its stickiest ethical problems. And obviously the banning of Donald Trump from Facebook and Twitter during the events of January 6th, all of these really important moments right now in the history of our relationship with technology. So, these are imagination questions too, about who gets to imagine in these different spaces and what that really means. So I'm excited to get back into that. And I think that we have a lot of work to do to come up with better imaginaries around AI and computation in general.
Well, thank you so much. So I will provide links in the video description for students and viewers who would like to check out some of the things that you have been talking about today. But I just wanted to say thank you again for taking the time to speak with us. I really appreciate it. And I wish you the best of luck with the center moving forward. And many happy years ahead.
Thank you, Christopher. Thank you for having me. And last thing I'll mention, all of our events are online now because of the pandemic. And so anybody who'd like to get on our mailing list or see, we do lots of fun things. We have a science fiction TV dinner series. And now that we moved it online, we have one of our imaginary fellows doing a cooking show for Mars, which is really cool. It's a little interstitial thing in our TV dinners. We have lots of other great events and conversations. So some of your viewers might be interested in checking those out.
Yeah, that sounds fabulous. I will probably end up checking those out. So yes, links in the description. And yes, Ed, thank you so much. And I will see everyone later.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Take care.